So, when it comes to the focus of my talk today, I think I can be a little bit literal in my thinking sometimes, and I spent a lot of time reading the conference prompt, I guess the original provocation, and I did take it really seriously, and I was like, okay, I really want to try to investigate some of these questions, particularly around the question of facticity and fictionalization and how that, these issues will come to bear on auto-theoretical and auto-fictional works. So I also wanted to talk about some other things more generally about auto theory, as well as some of my own recent research. So I'm going to cover a couple different points that I do see as constellating in a certain way. And I welcome your questions, of course, in the Q&A. All right, here we go. Also, I'm aware that my title is very cold and toward a standard of analysis, but it's really just, I think that I've spent a lot of time in preparation for this conference really trying to push my own understanding of auto theory and what it might mean to actually be a little bit more critical of developing kind of evaluative language, or particularly from the perspective of a practitioner too, like how to actually impose that standard on myself or oneself as a writer and a researcher. So I do see images like this as embodying auto theory as I was kind of understanding it in many ways. And when I was working with a lot of self-identified feminist artists, when I wrote my book, that was largely between 2016 to 2019 was when I sort of finished up most of the final edits. And then of course, 2020 happened and the world changed, and I went into the world and was done my PhD and started to see things differently too. So admittedly, my perspective on the auto-theoretical has shifted fairly substantially in the time since I wrote that book, even though I do see a lot of value in terms of ideas in that book as well. But this is an image by a former grad student of mine when I was teaching a, sorry, I'm also a little bit nervous. It's been a long time since I've presented. So my former grad student, Arezu Salamzadeh, I was teaching an autofiction and auto theory class in the context of a Master's of Visual Studies program. So they're like visual artists or curators and thinking about how they might apply auto-theoretical and auto-fictional frameworks and practices in the context of their own work. And I do see this as being a bit of an impulse within the way that auto theory can be taken up by certain artists and writers. This is just but one image in a much larger, more nuanced body of work, I should say. And Arezu made some really interesting crossword puzzles and word puzzles that were included in the ASAP journal issue that I co-edited with Alex Brostoff. And it was a real pleasure to be able to include work by my former students in that issue as well. But I think this idea of auto theory as a feminist practice, really kind of confronting a canon from a place that's quite affectively charged. A lot of the work that I was writing about by artists like Sona Safai and Hazel Meyer in my book, Canadian artists who are also kind of colleagues and friends of mine, a lot of the auto-theoretical work they made, similar to Arezu's piece here, came out of their time in graduate school, and I feel like that also really shapes the particular tonality of the work. There might be some frustration or feeling of not being able to see themselves or the body, in a literal kind of embodied way in the work and so on. So this idea to challenge these canons and write one story into the canon of legitimate knowledge while subverting this kind of dominant mode of theory. I will also apologize in advance. I don't know if I necessarily apologize, but I'll give you a heads up that they are pretty textual heavy slides, which I know isn't necessarily best practice, but I found this just to be helpful. I'm also happy to share these slides as needed. So most simply, auto theory is defined as a kind of combination of genres. The auto in the theory makes it simple to define it as, a combination of genres or modes, autobiography, theory, fiction, where the sum is greater than the parts. Thinking about auto theory as a kind of life thinking on the page perhaps or the stage about one's life, and then producing theory or philosophy through reflecting on one's lived experience. So, Banu Kapil via Sophia Samatar, writing and theorizing from lived experience as part of the research, and then having that exist alongside other investigations. And then auto theory as a practice of self-analysis, ? I know the place of psychoanalysis has been kind of hovering through these conversations. And I do have some questions about that too, and what place that kind of self-study plays in auto-theoretical work and how that's presented. So one thing I will say is I think it's important, the idea of writing and theorizing from lived experience as part of the research, and lived experience as critically reflected upon. And I think that auto theory gives permission, and that has both potentially like liberatory and positive effects, and potentially less positive effects. So I'm just put that there. I think that the criticality is an important part of that distinguishes it from perhaps just purely like autobiography. So thinking too about the necessity of this idea of auto theory fictions, which is the working title of my current book, thinking about the idea that every memoir in history is also a fiction of sorts, thinking about Gloria Ianzaldua's Autohistoria Teoria, the kind of self-history theory, or sometimes it can be translated as self-story theory, depending on if you're looking at the Spanish or the Portuguese. And I take that insight from, or I cite my colleague Alex Brostoff on that point, thinking about the idea of fictionalizing fact and factualizing fiction. I don't know if that's an oversimplified way to put it, but it occurred to me that if autofiction is a kind of fictionalizing of fact, then auto theory is a factualizing of fiction. The most obvious example of this when it comes to autofiction would be in the French tradition, the French 20th century tradition of the roman à clef, or novel with a key, where you quite literally have real life events and characters, and then their names have been changed. So there's very kind of thinly veiled fiction. And thinking too about, why not embrace the necessary concurrence of auto theory and fiction alongside. That does seem to be what we have been doing at this conference. So this is an image found in a journal by Octavia E. Butler. I really love this image. I think it's so great. Tell stories filled with facts, make people touch and taste and know, make people feel. So I'm hoping I don't need to introduce who Octavia E. Butler is, but just in case, very much ahead of her time, Black American science fiction writer, writing a lot of work that sometimes described as dystopic, but it could also be in some ways described as having a utopic impulse, certainly a kind of worlding and world making and world building. And there's an archive of her work at the Huntington Library in Los Angeles. So I was thinking about this idea of telling stories filled with facts, and the importance of kind of like invoking feeling, thinking about this as a kind of encapsulation of the larger project of literature. So this is where I risk being reductive, but I'm going to take that risk. What makes auto theory so appealing today? Some of the kind of like, we're going to do some like pros and cons of auto theory. So why is auto theory an art of the present? This was the notion of the art of the present ASAP journal that Alex and I co-edited an issue for, is this Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present. So we had to make this case in our introduction that thinking about why auto theory is an art of the present. So the more generous reading would be that one's lived experience is an important source of knowledge and insight into these larger issues, of course, and it's now finally being acknowledged as such by Western academia. So being able to actually bring the subjective into research in more direct ways seems to liberate a researcher from this quandary of objectivity versus subjectivity, and can thus feel freeing. So the writer and researcher in the humanities no longer has to kind of find ways to hide the fact that they are the writing I and the thinking I, that there are now ways that is being welcomed. Of course, this, as many presenters have noted this weekend, this is part of a much longer history and histories. There was certainly a lot of this happening in the 80s, for example, within kind of women and gender studies departments. And we see this crop up at other moments within the academy as well. And thinking about processing an idea through a situated or place-based, historical, or time-based and embodied point of view is actually imperative to good research. So this idea that it's not only about giving the writer permission to bring their self into the work, just like allowing this, but that there's the auto theorists might make the claim, I might make the claim that good research actually requires that there's something necessary about the lived experience and the auto-theoretical mode. And that's why it's actually going to lead to better research that's both rigorous and relevant. Okay, so the less generous reading, so this is just me trying to really like push on it. In the context of secular liberalism of the West, and its fairly, I would say, anti-religious ethos, the self emerges as a god of sorts, and that self is what gives the world order and meaning. And with that, it can be particularly challenging to actually challenge one's account of things. There's a kind of preciousness to our experience and our viewpoints, and I think perhaps at its worst, auto theory can lapse into this mode. One risks lapsing into a kind of uncritical self-aggrandizing and narcissism. I know I spent a lot of time in my book critiquing critiques of narcissism, but now I'm returning to the idea that there's actually are potentially harmful modes of narcissism, which we can talk about another time, that others must indulge. So even if the work is self-aware or autobiographical, it does not necessarily mean that it's critical, rigorous, auto-theoretical, beneficial to a public, useful, to use a word that I'm sure is making a lot of people cringe. The desire to tell my story and have it be the sole or main source of truth. So this becomes particularly thorny when another person's story, which they believe to be the most true, runs counter to or challenges another's. And how do you assess such conflicts? A kind of like he said, she said, they said, you know, how to assess that if, you know, you have two auto theories kind of running in opposition. What auto theory does well, it allows for ways, in my view, it allows for ways of being, thinking, researching, and writing that are hybrid and multiple. The auto theory, art, fiction, memoir, citation, all in this dynamic interplay. It really embraces the everyday life, each of our everyday lives as a site of meaning making, and I find that really rich and exciting, both from like a creative and a critical perspective. And a few folks have discussed the place of auto theory in the context of public-facing humanities, and auto theory as a kind of para-academic practice that has a demonstrated capacity to kind of straddle both the academic and the para-academic and even kind of extra or non-academic spaces, including the arts. And thinking about, too, the importance of the kind of mutual constituting and nourishing of theory and practice, which bell hooks called for. Hooks's claim that, you know, in order to actually call something feminist theory, it has to come from life and then feed back into life and community and, you know, politics. And without that, theory fails its promise. So yeah, it gives permission. That's something I've heard from a lot of folks as a positive. A number of people have emailed me about auto theory and have used this kind of language. It's often visual artists, interestingly enough, who feel that the framework of auto theory gives them permission to work in ways that they have wanted to or have always worked in, but found difficult to kind of articulate or justify or frame. Auto theory can transform what's considered legitimate knowledge and methodology in academia in a way that, at least in theory, promises to benefit those who are marginalized, fostering social justice, diversity, and equity from the ground up. And auto theory might prompt others to reflect on their positionality and stakes in a subject. So why am I doing this research or telling this particular story? Why me? What drives my curiosity? What do I have to contribute? What do I have to gain? Like, what are my what's my stake in this? And notably, the importance of lived experience has really emerged, I found, at least in Canada, as a condition for receiving funding, both within academic spaces, but also in the arts, especially film production. There's a real need. The idea if you're going to pitch a film or a TV series, why you? That's kind of actually like the first question that you will get now. And so you need to be ready to respond to those kinds of questions and have presumably done the reflection. Questions I've been asking to ensure the health of auto-theoretical work, both in terms of its political possibilities and in terms of its practitioners. Who has access to working in auto-theoretical ways? I've thought a bit about both both the privileges of working from one's life and also the risks that brings to bear. So that in and of itself is a complicated question that requires intersectional consideration. What are the intentions behind an auto-theoretical work? Are they honorable? Why might someone choose not to work auto-theoretically? I think this is a really important question that I've been thinking more about. And how can they be supported? So the decision for some to refuse the first person, I actually encountered this in an auto theory and auto fiction course I was teaching, where one of my grad students, for cultural and religious reasons, had a lot of discomfort around the idea of writing anything personal. And that was really a productive experience and conversation. And of course, I accommodated that. But this idea of the refusal of the first person is just as worthwhile of a positioning. And I do think it's notable too that the first person turn has occurred largely certainly we've been talking a lot about it in an American context and a French context. But if we were to look at writings of the Muslim world, for example, it might be a little bit different in terms of the treatment of the first person and the sharing of personal material. And then to be inclusive and resist the hegemony of Western modes in academia. If that is what the humanities today strives to do, then accepting and welcoming these differing views, of course, is necessary, I think. So just continuing this line of thought, and then I'm going to have a little bit of a shift. So thinking about some of the risks that auto theory opens us up to, or some of the problematics. And I really do share all of this as starting points for conversation. I'm by no means positing this as conclusions. These are really just things I've been thinking about. Part one would be the fallibility of the self. So auto theory is described as theorizing and writing from lived experience. Often what can be missed is that kind of critical reflection piece, or alongside or part of research. I think that auto theory as a utopic project has these really high hopes and potential, but that and this is what I've come to conclude for myself based on my lived experience, is that I think it takes the wisdom of some passage of time and reflection on an experience before one can properly write on it. That's my view. And that it also does take a great deal of maturity, certainly emotional maturity, to be able to actually approach your own perspective and experience with some criticality and even question it as part of the process of engendering knowledge and producing sound research that others can benefit from. Thinking too about, kind of reiterating some of my points here, but if we take theory from the Greek theoria, the hard work of contemplation, speculation, to witness or behold something with some kind of distance, perhaps even if that's the distance of time. So we had the fallibility of the self, and then we also had the place of ideology and community. And I really appreciate that the conference organizers were emphasizing this in their call, particularly the role of ideology in this question of the first person turn. So if my truth is my truth and your truth is your truth, and we're also post-truth, does anyone hear anything besides what affirms their truth? So fears today with the discourse of a kind of what it might mean for us to be in a post-truth world, the dissolution of the social fabric, what does this mean for relationality, for community, particularly community across ideological lines, maybe something that some people have just kind of given up on entirely. Thinking about the importance of context. So if auto theory is a tool, it doesn't belong to one group. So I've been thinking, and I if anyone disagrees, I would be really curious to take this up in the Q&A, but it occurs to me that there isn't anything necessarily leftist or progressive, for example, about auto theory inherently. So it's possible, as I list my example here, it's one could imagine, for example, an anti-trans pundit using an auto-theoretical mode to make their case against trans rights as alongside a trans artist who's using their lived experience in auto theory to make the case for their rights. So the idea of could the method in theory be used toward opposing ends? Okay, I'm gonna pause there. How are we all doing? I've been talking a lot. Okay, so now we're gonna just pivot. So, is Anne here still? Okay, Anne, I'm gonna add to your deja vu. It occurred to me yesterday when you were talking about the auto pun theory that I also have an auto pun theory. So when I was doing my, so I finished my PhD and finished the book project and went on to do a postdoc project. And the methodology I was using in my postdoctoral research is research creation, which is a term, I'm curious if it's a term that's used in the US, but in Canada, it's now being supported within academic funding structures. The idea is you can be making artwork and that constitutes the research. So I had and have an art practice, I decided to propose essentially auto-theoretical analyses of engaging with some of my own more auto-theoretical questions that I did not take up in much depth when I was a PhD student around culture, class, place, family, whiteness, settler colonialisms, a bunch of different themes that were in my mind, but I hadn't really had the time and space to properly engage with. I proposed a project where I would go back to Saskatchewan, where I grew up, and make work. It was quite open-ended and exploratory. I didn't necessarily know where it would end up. And one thing I will note, though, is that I started to move away from auto theory as the practice I was engaging with, even though auto theory was the kind of intention or orientation. And I want to come back to that. So I ended up making a body of work, and all of it had to do with cars or trucks in some way. And that was not conscious. It was like, as we were coming up with the title for the exhibition, that I'm like, oh my God, it's like an auto theory of auto theory. That's funny. But it just so happened, I think based on the place and the kind of site responsivity of the nature of the work I was doing, which is to say that I essentially went back, was doing a lot of journaling, reflecting, and really seeing what would arise in that place. I would later take an improv class too, and there's the phrase in improv of discovery, not invention, and I was really being led with that, like discovering what's here and learning from that. So I had this image of a car doing donuts in a parking lot. Does anyone know what donuts in a parking lot even means? Apparently one term is whipping a shitty, so I thought that was kind of interesting. So I was thinking about that as an image of idling. That there was also the Idle No More movement in the context of Canada, which was led by both Indigenous activists and non-Indigenous allies to get the government to stop idling on Indigenous rights and reconciliation initiatives. So I was making just kind of these more like abstract reflective pieces. I didn't necessarily know what they were. This was on Super 8 film. And yeah, so this is a description of the exhibition by the curator. So thinking about parafiction and humor to render an auto theory of auto theory, where white settler culture is analyzed through the symbol of cars and trucks. Parafiction ended up being my main mode or genre, and parafiction as practiced by artists like Waleed Rod would be one of probably the best known really fantastic parafictional artists, Jean Randolph as well, where you were presenting fiction as if it is fact. And that's really key. Because as we moved into this post-truth, kind of post-fact moment, Timothy mentioning this in the opening remarks to this conference, it occurred to me that the stakes of parafiction were higher, that it could actually be potentially dangerous to work in a parafictional mode where you're further muddying the waters of what is true and what is false and what is fact and what is not. Nevertheless, I decided to play with this mode. And I made this, so these are some other images of other works I was doing with Super 8, which is like a slower way of working. So the main piece I ended up making was a video called The Truck Guys. And essentially the inspiration, so QAnon was building in its influence, seemed to be. And that was really scaring me, kind of troubling me. And I was really concerned at the idea that conspiracy theories would start to supplant, other forms of knowledge. This was pre-COVID too, notably. And then COVID happened around the time I was making this work, which meant that I was supposed to be in Saskatchewan for 2 months, and I ended up there for 1.5 years, staying with family, and that was definitely unexpected and changed things too. But as far as the time goes, it did slow down time for me, and I spent a lot of time trying to just get some space, and I would go in my car and just drive to the outskirts of town, and I'd often just sit in parking lots and reflect, because why not, I guess. And when I was sitting in these parking lots, it occurred to me, I'm like, okay, there are pickup trucks everywhere. Like every second thing I see is a pickup truck. And I just started to observe that because I wasn't used to that in Toronto. And I was thinking about the logic of conspiracy theories and the idea of finding patterns and then making meaning from those patterns. So the idea of like, oh, this phenomenon's cropping up, that must mean, this. And with conspiracy theories, there's often a desire to put all of the world's problems and ills onto a group that becomes like the big other and vilified and like demonized. So I was like, okay, I kind of want to do like an anatomy of a conspiracy theory. I just want to make something weird. I'm not going to overthink it. What would it mean to kind of improvise a narrative about this conspiracy theory of pickup truck drivers who are behind like all of the world's problems? So I invented a persona for myself, and it was inspired by a kind of like incel beta male, but a woman who always wanted to go to university, but didn't get the opportunity, but kind of was like a know-it-all. So that was the character. And I was improvising this script from that persona. And it was really interesting and liberatory in some ways because I'd never worked in that mode. And a second character ended up emerging who was a recovered truck guy who was essentially giving my main character intel about this secret cabal of pickup truck drivers. And that was also me, but I just distorted the voice to make it sound more masculine. So these are just some different film stills to give you a sense of the visual language. So then a really funny, weird thing happened. So I returned to this Walmart parking lot a couple times, and there was a license plate with the vanity plate R Toad. And I was like, that's so random. Like think about R Toad, Theater of Cruelty. And then I started seeing it more than once. And I'm like, okay, that's actually getting pretty funny and weird. So I was assuming that the person must have worked there or is, I guess, a regular, but they were always parked in around the same spot. So there were kind of like real life funny things happening as part of the fun and power, I think, of working in a more improvisational mode. By the end of the film, after the protagonist, starts from this place of kind of hyper paranoia and anxiety, needing to figure out the truck guys and defeat them, has these conversations with this recovered truck guy, kind of forms this friendship, and finally comes around to being like, okay, I'm going to, kind of move forward with my life without fixating on this, and I'm not going to spend any more time in parking lots. So in my mind, this was a totally like kooky idea. It didn't really have a lot of like signifiers in the real world. Though as I was making it, I did start to understand what it was allegorizing. When it came to the themes and issues that I wanted to take up in my research that I mentioned, it occurred to me that, this could be an allegory for the way that structural racism works in places like the prairies, but also in Canada more broadly. certainly especially anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, Islamophobia, the kind of like xenophobic surveillance cultures, the idea of, and we hear this all the time in Canada, like the immigrants are like, the reason why the economy is tanking. So this idea, this desire to put the blame on this group after you're seeing more of like these people around. So to put it really crassly, I was seeing what I was doing as a kind of like allegorizing of that. So essentially stepping away from auto theory, but coming back to auto theory, whether I kind of liked it or not. So the film premiered in Toronto. It had some really good reception. Some of my former grad students came and found it funny, which was relieving. I'm like, it's supposed to be funny. It's like, I think people forget when they go into a gallery, they're like, can I laugh? I'm like, I hope you'll laugh. And then it was on the cover of this magazine called Black Flash, which is a Canadian art publication. And one of the editors commissioned me to write a feature article about the process behind having made that film. And this was a good opportunity for me to write in an auto-theoretical way about the process behind that film and what I now see it reflecting and providing commentary on when it comes to certain pressing present-day issues. So the month before the exhibition launched in Toronto, this happened in Canada, the trucker convoy, which was also called the Freedom Convoy. I'm sure some of you may have seen this because it did reach more international audiences. So that was a further coincidence. And I was like, okay, it's going to seem like I made this work about the trucker convoy, even though obviously I'd made it the year prior. But it added to the context and potential resonances of what that film could mean. So here's a piece in Vox. The freedom convoy that has besieged Ottawa isn't a people's revolt, it's a fringe movement protesting its defeat. So, to sum it up, essentially the convoy, to be fairly reductive about it, was a kind of more alt-right, populist protest against COVID mandates, but ended up becoming also a site for a lot of grievances and a lot of white grievance around the economy. And there was some racial diversity within the movement, which a lot of people tried to emphasize, that this was more of a class-based issue. But a lot of the people who were occupying the Capitol, kind of Parliament Hill in Ottawa for 3 weeks, were white Canadians, and there was a lot of commentary at the time about how they were treated much, much differently than any other protest has ever been treated. They were not moved out. The police seemed to kind of like cower and just sort of let them. It was quite strange, even just from a kind of basic law and order perspective. There's like images of police giving protesters like coffees, and a lot of people would say, can you imagine if these were Black protesters, Indigenous protesters, holding this, Muslim protesters, it would be a very different story, one can imagine. So I do find that it was a productive experience working in this mode that I had never worked in. I ended up with a kind of autofiction of sorts that was also a parafiction. It became an allegory for different social issues, a better understanding of my own background and place, which would then inform future auto theories. So I will admit, I feel like I went back home with a certain kind of romanticizing that started to shift, better understanding the ideology and values of a place, having some kind of closure and healing when it comes to that place of self-analysis and self-study. And yeah, on a very somber note, there were other present-day social issues in Canada or recent horrors that had happened involving cars and trucks and violences done by white Canadians against people of color. So an Indigenous woman, Barbara Kentner, was killed by a man who threw a trailer hitch at her from a moving car in 2017. And as far as I know, he was since acquitted. And then you have the Afzal family, who were killed by being run over by a car in 2021 for looking visibly Muslim by a young white man in his early 20s. And then you have the freedom convoy of semi-trucks. So as I kind of step back, I did start to realize that what began from a place of more absurdity and thinking about, what if this, upside down world of conspiracy existed, I started to realize maybe there's actually a lot of truth to what the film was getting at, and a lot of problems that remain in Canada today. So I think I just have a couple minutes left here. I don't want to go 1 minute. Okay. So I will wrap up here. But I will say, how does one's ideological positioning impact what constitutes a fact and what constitutes a fiction? Ideology, kind of returning to some of these original questions that the conference organizers put forward, how we recall our lived experience, from memory is going to impact fact and fiction, how we each remember today's talk. If we were to each write an account of it, they're going to be different. And then also, how does one's ideological positioning impact what constitutes a fact and a fiction? If we were to ask it depends on who you would ask to, discuss a particularly contentious present day issue. When it comes to Iman Zaoury's I Am From Palestine, a film from 2023, it depends on who you ask if this is a fiction or an autobiography, for example, or an autofiction or an auto-theory. Thinking about the lived experience of those from Palestine who would reference that as their country of origin. And this was a recent event back in March that Passport Canada had removed Palestine as an option for passports. So there's this 90-year-old Palestinian Canadian woman who could no longer have that on her passport, and it created all this bureaucratic confusion. So I mentioned that as a reminder that the idea of fact and fiction and alternative fact and ideology really is so dependent on our positioning and our lived experience. And that I do think we live in a time of increasing global urgencies, and that as writers, artists, researchers, we do have this responsibility to consider the impact of our work, the stakes, the relevance, priorities, and that working with the intention of auto-theory doesn't necessarily mean that it will take an auto-theoretical form, that you might end up somewhere else. And I think that auto-theory has a lot of great potential and continues to, but its potential also depends on whose hands it is in. And I will close there. Thanks so much for listening.